I came home 2 days early and found her sandals at my staircase. I thought I had just caught them in a predictable affair, but in less than an hour, I realized those shoes did not just lead to a bed. They led to a plan to swallow my house, my assets, my reputation, and the life I built for 10 years. Their biggest mistake was giving a fraud investigator time to sit down and open her laptop. My name is Andrea Langley. I am 38 years old, and for the greater part of my professional life, I have made a very lucrative living by finding the exact things that people try very hard to hide. As a vice president of vendor risk compliance at Blackridge Compliance Group, my days are spent hunting down phantom vendors, forged invoices, and the subtle, seemingly innocuous anomalies that signal massive corporate fraud. I am trained to look at a peaceful, perfect surface and see the rot underneath. Yet, the hardest anomaly to spot is always the one sitting right inside your own front door. The Dallas acquisition had imploded at the 11th hour. It was a messy collapse, full of undisclosed liabilities and panicked executives sweating through their expensive suits in a windowless boardroom. Instead of staying in Texas for another 48 hours to sort through the wreckage of someone else's lies, I decided to cut the trip short. I booked an early flight back to Philadelphia. I did not send a text. I did not make a phone call. I wanted the quiet comfort of my own home, and I wanted to surprise my husband. Nolan Pierce. Coming home 2 days early was supposed to be a small, spontaneous victory in an otherwise exhausting week. The cab dropped me off under a heavy, overcast afternoon sky. I dragged my roller suitcase up the short flight of stone steps to our 3-story brick townhouse, moving with the heavy fatigue of airport travel. I slid my key into the heavy oak door, turned the deadbolt, and pushed it open. The air conditioning washed over me, crisp and familiar, carrying the faint scent of the cedarwood diffuser we kept in the foyer. But the moment my foot crossed the threshold, my entire body simply stopped. I did not gasp. I did not drop my bags. I froze, my eyes locking onto the polished hardwood floor at the base of the grand staircase. There, carelessly kicked off, as if the wearer could not be bothered to walk 2 more steps to the closet, was a pair of Nolan's brown leather loafers. And sitting right beside them, aligned with a brazen, terrifying comfort, was a pair of metallic gold strappy sandals. I knew those sandals. I knew the exact designer, the price tag, and the woman who wore them. They belonged to Vivian Shaw, my closest friend, the woman who had stood next to me at my wedding, who knew my coffee order by heart, who had a key to this very house for emergencies. Her shoes were sitting in my foyer, pointing upwards toward the 2nd floor, intimately tangled with my husband's shoes. The immediate, visceral punch of betrayal should have sent me flying up those stairs. A normal woman, a normal wife, would have dropped her luggage, screamed a name, and stormed the master bedroom to shatter the cheating couple's reality. I felt the heat of that urge rise in my chest, a sudden spike of adrenaline that made the blood roar in my ears. But then, the sounds drifted down from the 2nd floor. The house was incredibly quiet, magnifying every acoustic detail from above. I heard a laugh. It was Vivian's laugh, bright and familiar, but it was not the breathless, hushed sound of a woman tangled in illicit sheets. It was a busy, distracted laugh. Then came the heavy mechanical scrape of a wooden drawer sliding forcefully open on its metal tracks. A second later, a distinct metallic clink echoed down the stairwell. It sounded like heavy keys, or perhaps the heavy brass clasp of a lockbox hitting a solid surface. The blood that had been roaring in my ears suddenly turned to ice. The forensic instincts that I utilized every single day at Blackridge violently hijacked my emotional response. My brain abruptly categorized the scene not as a heartbreak, but as a crime scene. Why would they be aggressively pulling out drawers? If my husband and my best friend were simply using my absence to sleep together, they would be in the bed. They would not be rummaging through the solid oak furniture in the master suite. Something was fundamentally, structurally wrong with this picture, and charging up the stairs blind was the worst possible tactical move. I gripped the handle of my suitcase and lifted it entirely off the floor, refusing to let the wheels roll and announce my presence. I stepped out of my own heels, holding them in my left hand, and walked silently in my stocking feet. I placed the suitcase gently inside the hall closet, moving with the agonizing slowness of a ghost. I was preserving the environment. I was keeping the subjects unaware. As I turned back toward the hallway, my eyes brushed past the glowing digital screen of the home security panel mounted on the wall. The green light indicated the alarm was off, but it was the tiny line of text beneath the status indicator that made my breath catch in my throat. System disarmed. Guest code. I stared at the glowing letters, letting the data point settle into my mind. Nolan lived here. If Nolan had unlocked the front door and walked in with Vivian, he would have punched in his master code, or the system would have automatically recognized his phone's proximity sensor. But the system was disarmed by the guest code, the specific 6-digit sequence I had given to Vivian months ago so she could water my plants when we traveled. That meant Vivian had opened the door. Vivian had let Nolan into his own house, or she had arrived first and he had followed, allowing her to control the entry. Or, worse, they had purposefully used the guest code because they knew my phone received push notifications whenever a master code was used during my business trips. They were managing my data. They were managing my perception. A cold, absolute clarity washed over me. This was not a crime of passion. This was a procedure. I did not call out Nolan's name. I did not walk toward the staircase. Instead, I pivoted smoothly and walked straight into my home office on the first floor. The room was shadowed, the heavy velvet curtains drawn against the afternoon light. I stepped inside and pushed the heavy mahogany door until it was almost perfectly closed, leaving a gap no wider than a pencil so I could still hear the house. I walked over to the dark leather chair behind my desk, sat down, and opened my work laptop. The screen flared to bright, clinical life, casting a blue glow over my face. My hands, completely steady, hovered over the keyboard. I opened a blank encrypted document. It was the exact same protocol I followed whenever a whistleblower sent an anonymous tip about a rigged supply chain or a corrupt vendor contract. I typed the date. I typed the time. I created a timeline header. I was no longer a wife discovering an affair. I was the vice president of vendor risk compliance, and I had just opened an active investigation into my own life. I sat in the quiet dark of my office, my fingers resting lightly on the keys, staring at the blinking cursor. The silence of the first floor was profound, acting as a perfect acoustic chamber for the noises drifting down from the master bedroom. I heard footsteps pacing, heavy, deliberate steps. Nolan. Then, his voice drifted down the stairwell, clear, sharp, and entirely devoid of romance. "Check the drawer again." I hit the save button on my blank document. The war had already started, and they had no idea I was already on the battlefield. I pulled up the primary control panel for our smart home network on my laptop. I bypassed the user-friendly interface that showed the temperature and the lighting presets, diving straight into the raw security system logs. I sorted the entry data for the front door deadbolt over the last 2 months. There it was, displayed in neat, indisputable rows of data. Vivian had used her guest code exactly 9 times in the past 6 weeks. I opened my own calendar on a second monitor and cross-referenced the timestamps with my travel itinerary. 8 of those 9 entries occurred on days I was entirely out of the state for client audits. The pattern was aggressively clear, but affairs are often sloppy and impulsive. Fraud, however, is calculated. I tabbed over to the security camera feeds. We had a wide-angle camera pointing at the second-floor landing, positioned right outside the master suite. The live feed on my screen was currently a flat, black box. I pulled the hardware diagnostics, looking for a power failure or a disconnected signal. The camera had not malfunctioned. It had been manually toggled off from the administrative application. I checked the operation logs for the past 6 weeks. Every single time Vivian's guest code unlocked the front door, the second-floor camera went dark within 60 seconds. The exterior cameras, the kitchen camera, the garage camera, all remained perfectly active, happily recording the empty spaces of the house. They were intentionally creating a highly specific blind spot. They were managing my data to manage my perception. I opened another window and logged into the shared family calendar. For the past 4 months, Nolan had blocked out Tuesday and Thursday afternoons for what he vaguely labeled as material site visits. Nolan owned Pierce Atelier Homes, a boutique custom construction firm that built high-end properties. I opened a backdoor portal I still maintained on his company server, a digital remnant from when I helped him restructure his corporate debt 2 years ago. I pulled the master project schedule and the current labor logs. There were absolutely no active job sites requiring material inspections on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. He was billing his own time to a phantom project to justify his absence. The affair was rigidly scheduled. It was a routine, but a scheduled affair still did not explain the metallic clinking and the aggressive opening of drawers I had heard just moments ago. You do not need to empty a locked cabinet to sleep with someone. My heart rhythm slowed into a steady, predatory beat. I dug deeper into the Pierce Atelier Homes financial server. Nolan thought he had changed all the administrative passwords after the restructuring 2 years ago, but he lacked the technical fluency to realize he had never revoked my read-only access to the primary corporate ledger. What I found waiting for me in the ledger was a massive financial hemorrhage. I scrolled through a series of late fee notices. I found urgent wire transfer requests bouncing back due to insufficient funds. And then, the red flags multiplied into something much darker. I opened a folder containing correspondence and found 3 formal warning letters from a private equity firm called Ashwell Bridge Capital. They were a bridge loan fund, the exact kind of aggressive, high-interest lender that real estate developers only use when they are desperate for fast, short-term cash and all the traditional banks have permanently closed their doors. The letters were brutal. Pierce Atelier Homes was not just struggling, it was completely insolvent. Nolan was days away from a total default that would wipe out his company and trigger a cascade of personal liability lawsuits from his current clients. He was drowning in debt. Why were they rummaging through my personal files upstairs? I minimized the financial ledger and accessed the local network router for the house. I clicked into the memory cache of our home office laser printer. The printer history is a graveyard of secrets that amateur liars never think to scrub. The log showed a massive print job processed exactly 2 days ago, right after I left for the airport. It was a single document, 45 pages long. The spooler still held the metadata for the individual files that made up the batch. I read the file names, and the ambient temperature in my office seemed to plummet. There was a high-resolution scan of the deed to the townhouse. There was a full-color copy of my United States passport. And most terrifying of all, there were 4 distinct image files, labeled simply as signature samples. I felt a cold sweat break out across my collarbone. My hands remained perfectly still on the keyboard. I moved to the shared cloud storage drive that Nolan and I used for household documents like tax returns and insurance policies. I found a synchronization folder that had been hastily deleted, but the digital trash bin had not been emptied. I restored the files, downloading them directly to an encrypted partition on my hard drive. The document titles stared back at me, glowing violently against the dark theme of my screen. Consent final, property addendum, closing draft. The pieces of the puzzle snapped together with a sickening, violent clarity. This was never just about Vivian sleeping with my husband. The affair was merely the operational cover. The townhouse we lived in was purchased by me, entirely in my own name, 3 years before I ever met Nolan. It was protected under an ironclad prenuptial structure that he had always resented and clearly never fully understood. He believed that because he had paid for the kitchen remodel and the basement finishing last year, the property had somehow commingled into a marital asset. He was legally and fundamentally wrong, but he was utterly desperate. Ashwell Bridge Capital was closing in. His company was collapsing, and he needed a massive injection of capital in less than a week to avoid total ruin. I sat back in my heavy leather chair, the blue light of the screen illuminating the absolute stillness of my face. I listened to the floorboards creak above my head. They were not upstairs looking for lingerie or a hidden love letter to spice up their afternoon. They were upstairs looking for the original notarized documents in my fireproof safe. They were actively constructing a paper trail to forge my signature, attach a fraudulent spousal consent addendum to a loan application, and leverage my completely paid-off home for a massive bridge loan to save his sinking company. I took a deep, silent breath, letting the air fill my lungs as the reality of the situation settled into my bones. I had walked through my front door 10 minutes ago as a wife suspecting an emotional betrayal. I was now a target uncovering a high-stakes identity theft ring operating out of my own master bedroom. And the two people meticulously planning to steal my life had absolutely no idea that the woman whose financial execution they were drafting was sitting right beneath them, quietly tracking every single digital footprint they left behind. I unlocked the bottom drawer of my desk. Tucked beneath a stack of blank legal pads was an older generation tablet. Nolan used to use it to control the patio speakers before we upgraded the sound system. But he had a terrible habit of never logging out of his primary cloud account. I plugged the device into a silent power bank, booted it up, and bypassed the lock screen with the generic 4-digit code he used for absolutely everything. The messaging application populated on the screen. I initiated a deep recovery protocol, pulling down the cached communication data he firmly believed he had wiped clean. The thread with Vivian materialized instantly. It took exactly 4 swipes to confirm the physical affair. There were hotel room numbers spelled out, specific times to meet, and endless complaints about how emotionally cold I was. It had been going on for at least 8 months. The betrayal of my body and my marriage was right there in sharp, undeniable black and white. Yet, what made my stomach drop was not the romance. It was the absolute lack of it in the recent weeks. The tone of their texts had violently shifted from stolen afternoons to the clinical, high-stakes language of a corporate merger. I read a message Vivian sent 3 days ago. "Did you secure the signature page?" Nolan replied an hour later. "Still looking. She has files everywhere. We need the closing finalized by Friday. You have to get her out before Thursday." Vivian wrote back, "If she is in the house when the appraiser does the drive-by, the lender will flag the entire application." The sheer calculation of it was suffocating. I kept scrolling, my eyes burning from the screen glare. Vivian was not just a passive mistress waiting for a man to leave his wife. She was the primary architect of my ruin. I found a massive block of text where she explicitly coached my husband on how to destroy our marriage from the inside out. Start a fight about her travel schedule. Vivian advised him in a message dated 2 weeks ago. "Tell her she never invests in the marriage. Push her buttons until she snaps. If she packs a bag and goes to a hotel for a few days to cool off, we can document it. We need to establish a narrative of abandonment." They were actively trying to build a legal profile of a volatile, absent wife who voluntarily walked away from her marital home. They actually believed that if I left in a fit of anger, it would severely weaken my claim to the property. It was a pathetic, amateur understanding of real estate law. Nolan had poured perhaps $80,000 into remodeling our kitchen and finishing the basement last year. In his mind, and clearly in Vivian's, that financial contribution magically transformed my solely owned property into a joint marital asset. They thought investing equity meant legal ownership. They had no idea that the legal structure I put in place when I bought the townhouse before our wedding specifically walled off the deed from any commingling, regardless of who paid for the new marble countertops. But desperate people do not consult competent lawyers. They consult each other. I needed to know exactly why Vivian was so deeply invested in my husband's financial rescue mission. Nolan was trying to save his construction firm from complete collapse, but Vivian was risking federal wire fraud by helping him forge mortgage documents. People do not risk federal prison just for love. They risk it for survival. I minimized the messaging application and opened a secure browser window. I ran a shadow search on Vivian's luxury event planning agency. It only took me 10 minutes navigating the state civil court dockets to find her true motive. Vivian was drowning just as fast as Nolan. Her company was facing a massive, unsealed lawsuit filed by a former client over a catastrophic charity gala that took place 4 months ago. The court filing alleged that Vivian had embezzled over $300,000 in vendor deposits. She was on the verge of total bankruptcy, her flawless reputation as a high society event planner mere days from being publicly and permanently annihilated. The deleted messages suddenly made perfect, terrifying sense. They were going to drain the equity out of my house, use half of the fraudulent loan to keep Nolan's construction company afloat, and use the other half to quietly settle Vivian's lawsuit before it ever went to trial. They were using my life savings as a personal slush fund to cover their mutual, spectacular failures. A heavy thud vibrated through the ceiling right above my head. They were directly above my office now, moving into the master walk-in closet. My breath caught in my throat. The closet. While they were busy ransacking the upstairs, I remembered a secondary storage space I maintained. I did not keep my most sensitive historical documents in the master bedroom safe. Anyone could find that. I kept a discreet, fireproof lockbox bolted to the floorboards beneath the heavy winter coats in the small closet right here in my office. I stood up, leaving my shoes by the desk, and padded silently across the rug. I opened the office closet door, the hinges well-oiled and soundless. I knelt in the dark, pushed aside a heavy wool trench coat, and spun the combination dial on the small steel box, 34, 12, 68. The heavy latch clicked open. I pulled out a thick accordion folder. It contained old tax returns, voided contracts, and the complete paper trail of a mortgage refinancing I had started 5 years ago, but ultimately canceled before execution. It was a dead file, utterly useless to me, but not useless to a forger. I flipped through the thick manila dividers. My fingers stopped cold. A section in the exact middle was entirely empty. I knew exactly what used to be in that specific slot. It was a blank addendum page from the old refinancing packet. At the bottom of that page, there was a perfectly valid, raised seal from a licensed notary public, and right next to it, my authentic, wet ink signature. My vision narrowed to the empty manila folder. They had already been in this box. Nolan must have found the backup key during one of his previous searches when I was out of town. They did not just have a digital scan of my passport and a forged electronic signature. They possessed a physical, legally binding piece of paper with my real signature and a real verifiable notary stamp. All they had to do was digitally stitch that bottom half to a newly printed fraudulent loan consent form, and no bank processor in the world would be able to spot the splice during a routine desk review. The tightening in my chest was no longer panic or heartbreak. It was a lethal, hyper-focused rage. They had not just plotted to take my home, they had already stolen the very mechanism to execute the theft. The trap was not just set. The timer was actively counting down to Friday. I closed the fireproof box, locked the dial, and arranged the wool coat exactly as it had been. I walked back to my desk and sat down. The quiet murmur of their voices drifted through the ceiling vents. They sounded relaxed. They thought they had everything they needed. They thought the hardest part of their plan was over. I stared at the glowing screen of my laptop, the deleted texts serving as a digital testament to their profound greed. They wanted me to be the emotional, unstable wife who stormed out and abandoned her life in a tearful rage. They were entirely unprepared for the woman who made a living dissecting fraudulent schemes piece by piece, dollar by dollar. They wanted my house. Now, I was going to ensure they lost absolutely everything else. I closed my laptop and stood up. The urge to confront them with righteous fury was entirely gone, replaced by the chilling calm of a predator waiting in the brush. I walked out of my office and headed straight for the open-plan kitchen at the back of the first floor. I did not try to be quiet anymore. I deliberately let my bare feet slap lightly against the hardwood. I walked over to the espresso machine, grabbed a ceramic mug from the open shelving, and hit the power button. The machine whirred to life with a loud, mechanical grind that echoed perfectly up the open stairwell. Above me, the floorboards instantly went dead silent. The sudden absence of movement was deafening. I imagined the sheer, electric panic shooting through their veins. I leaned against the cool marble of the kitchen island, cradling my empty mug, and waited. It took them 2 full minutes to negotiate their descent. When they finally appeared at the bottom of the staircase, the visual was almost comical. Nolan stepped into the kitchen first. He stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes darting from my face to my bare feet and back again. The color drained from his face so fast he looked physically ill. Behind him, Vivian practically collided with his back. She was clutching her metallic gold sandals against her chest like a protective shield. Vivian recovered a fraction of a second faster than my husband. She forced a bright, painfully wide smile onto her face. "Oh my God, you are home," Vivian said, her voice pitched half an octave too high. "You scared us half to death. We thought we had an intruder." I did not smile back. I took a slow sip of the hot water I had poured into my mug. "My flight from Dallas was rebooked," I said, my tone perfectly flat. "I thought my trip was supposed to last until Thursday." "Right, exactly." Nolan jumped in, his words tumbling over each other in a rush to fill the heavy silence. "That is exactly why Viv is here. We were trying to plan a surprise for you." "A surprise," I repeated. "An anniversary dinner," Vivian added quickly, nodding with frantic enthusiasm. "Nolan wanted to rent out the private dining room at that French place you love downtown, and he needed my help with the guest list and the floral arrangements. We were trying to get everything nailed down before you got back on Thursday." It was a spectacularly pathetic lie. We did not have an anniversary coming up for another 4 months. Furthermore, they were currently standing in my kitchen in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, miles away from any floral shop or restaurant. But I did not point out the calendar discrepancy. I let my eyes drift lazily over Vivian. She was wearing a pair of tailored black trousers and a soft, powder blue cashmere sweater. The sweater fit her perfectly. It should fit perfectly, considering I bought it for myself in Paris 3 years ago and had left it folded on the top shelf of my master closet. "That is a lovely sweater, Vivian," I said gently. Her hand flew to her collarbone as if she had been burned. She looked down, realizing her mistake in real time. The flush of deep, humiliating red crept up her neck. Nolan tried to step between us, physically blocking my line of sight to his mistress. He was sweating now, a fine sheen of moisture gathering at his temples. He was too slow, too clumsy, completely failing to explain why 2 people planning a dinner party were rummaging through the second floor in the middle of a workday. I placed my mug down on the marble counter. The ceramic made a sharp, definitive click. "So," I began, letting the single syllable hang in the air for a deeply uncomfortable moment, "what were you 2 looking for in my bedroom?" The reaction was microscopic but undeniable. For half a second, the carefully constructed masks of surprise and innocence shattered. Nolan's jaw tightened. Vivian's eyes darted frantically toward the staircase. They thought they had been caught having an affair. Now, they were suddenly terrified they had been caught committing a felony. Nolan immediately deployed his oldest, most rehearsed defense mechanism. He went on the offensive. He aggressively ran a hand through his hair and let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "Are you seriously doing this right now?" Nolan demanded, his voice rising in volume to feign righteous indignation. "You come home days early. You sneak into the house without saying a word and immediately start interrogating us? This right here is exactly why things have been so cold between us for a long time." He stepped closer to the island, leaning over the marble to invade my space. He was trying to dominate the room physically, trying to drag the conversation away from the missing documents and plunge it deep into the murky, subjective waters of our failing marriage. "You are always looking for a problem," he continued, pointing an accusatory finger at me. "You are obsessed with your work. You treat this house like a hotel, and you treat me like one of your corporate suspects. I am allowed to have a friend over. I am allowed to exist in my own home without you treating me like a criminal." It was a masterful pivot. If I were a different woman, I would have taken the bait. I would have screamed about the hotel receipts and the deleted texts I had just read downstairs. I would have thrown my own travel schedule in his face. I would have laid all my cards on the table in a spectacular, cathartic explosion. But I am not a different woman. I am an auditor, and an auditor never reveals the extent of their evidence while the suspect is still talking. I looked right through his anger. I did not raise my voice. I simply turned my gaze back to the woman cowering behind him. "Vivian," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion, You need to leave my house right now. She blinked, clutching her sandals tighter. Andrea, please. You have to understand. I understand perfectly. I cut her off, my tone slicing through the air like a razor. Put your shoes on and leave. Now. Vivian looked at Nolan for support, but he was staring at the floor, his jaw clenched, unable to protect her. She swallowed hard, dropped her sandals onto the floor, and hurriedly strapped them onto her feet. She practically sprinted toward the front door. The heavy oak slammed shut behind her, the sound echoing through the quiet house. Now, it was just the two of us. I looked at Nolan. The bravado had instantly drained out of him the moment his audience left. He looked small, cornered, and deeply uncertain of what to say next. If you want to keep talking, I told him, picking up my mug again, we can talk, but do not ever try to manage me in my own kitchen again. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words failed him. I did not wait for a response. I walked right past him, the scent of his panicked sweat mixing with the smell of brewing coffee, and headed straight up the stairs. I needed to verify the absolute final piece of the puzzle. I bypassed the guest room and walked straight into the master suite. The air in the room felt disturbed. The closet doors left slightly ajar. I walked past the row of hanging clothes and knelt in the back corner, pulling up the false floorboard to reveal the primary steel safe set into the foundation. I punched in my 6-digit biometric code. The heavy bolts retracted with a solid thud. I pulled the heavy door open and began a rapid, precise inventory of the contents. The jewelry was untouched. The cash reserves were intact. But the primary legal folder, the one containing the original deed to the property, had been shifted. It was sitting on top of the stack instead of filed in the back. I pulled it out and flipped through the heavy parchment pages. My stomach turned over. When I checked the decoy box downstairs in my office earlier, I had found the missing signature page from an expired refinancing packet, but checking the master safe confirmed my absolute worst fear. Not only had they stolen the signature page from downstairs, but they had also completely removed the original, notarized property addendum from the master file up here. They had successfully gathered every single physical component required to execute a flawless forgery. They had exactly what they needed, and they had absolutely no idea that I knew. I walked out of the master bedroom, bypassed my husband who was still standing paralyzed at the bottom of the staircase, and walked straight out the front door. I did not take a bag. I did not take my coat. I got into my car, locked the heavy doors, and dialed the only person on earth who could build an impenetrable fortress around my life before the end of the week. Celia Marr was not just a seasoned family law attorney. She was a brutal, highly tactical asset protection specialist. 10 years ago, she had drafted the ironclad prenuptial agreement that Nolan was currently trying to circumvent. I explained the situation to her in cold, clinical terms as I drove away from my own neighborhood. I detailed the missing signature page, the printed property deed, the deleted cloud folders, and the impending bridge loan deadline. Celia did not offer me soft sympathy or ask how my heart was handling the betrayal. She immediately transitioned into wartime protocol. "We are locking down the perimeter right this second," Celia said, her voice a sharp crackle through the car speakers. "I am sending a preliminary notice of dispute to the county recorder of deeds this afternoon. I am also placing a hard, universal freeze on your social security number and all associated financial identifiers with the 3 major credit bureaus. No one is opening a line of credit for a single dollar in your name. They're going to try to submit the loan packet by Friday morning," I told her, my grip tightening on the steering wheel. "Let them try," she replied smoothly. "By tomorrow morning, any title company, underwriter, or notary who pulls your file will see a massive, flashing red fraud alert. But we need to secure the physical assets immediately. Everything you still have in your possession needs to disappear from that house today." I drove straight to my primary financial institution in the commercial district. I rented their largest available steel safe deposit box. Sitting alone in the sterile, windowless viewing room at the bank, I performed a rigorous chain of custody protocol, identical to the ones I utilized during high-stakes corporate investigations. I laid out a fresh blank sheet of white paper on the metal table. I carefully arranged my authentic passport, my original birth certificate, the master copy of the property deed, and every remaining piece of sensitive financial history I possessed. I photographed each individual item next to a copy of the daily financial newspaper to legally establish the date and time. I photographed the transfer of the documents into the steel box. I was treating my own existence like an active evidence locker. My next step was to secure my professional flank. At Blackridge Compliance Group, a compromised personal identity was grounds for an immediate, mandatory leave of absence. I could not risk Nolan's criminal desperation infecting my career. I drove to my office building, bypassed my own department, and requested a closed-door meeting with our internal general counsel. I handed him a highly classified, heavily redacted memorandum. I stated clearly that my personal digital signature and physical identification materials had been actively compromised by a known domestic actor. I formally requested a preemptive silent flag on all my corporate authorizations and internal approvals. I essentially ordered an audit on myself before the fallout could ever reach my firm. By Wednesday morning, the scope of the battle expanded. I could not simply rely on the digital screenshots I had taken on my own laptop. In a contentious divorce, a desperate spouse will inevitably claim that the other party fabricated or manipulated the digital evidence. I needed an unimpeachable, independent third party. Per Celia's strict instructions, I engaged a private digital forensics contractor who specialized in corporate espionage. I gave the contractor remote administrative access to my home network while Nolan was out at his failing construction site. Within 4 hours, the expert had mirrored the entire cloud storage account. He captured the raw printer spool logs in a read-only, evidentiary format that would hold up in federal court. He documented the exact device identification numbers and IP addresses that had manually disabled the second-floor security camera system. He created a sterile, mathematically verifiable evidence chain that Nolan could never dismiss as a jealous wife's technological parlor trick. While the forensic contractor was mapping the local network, he flagged a hidden, encrypted subdirectory on Nolan's desktop computer. He cracked the partition and found a cache of vendor agreements for Pierce Atelier Homes. I scrolled through them and found a document that made the blood run entirely cold in my veins. It was a commercial credit application for a major wholesale lumber supplier. The application was dated 8 months ago. On page 4, under the section reserved for personal guarantors, Nolan had listed my full legal name, my executive title at Blackridge, and my estimated annual salary. He had not explicitly forged my signature on that specific line, but he had aggressively listed me as an unofficial financial backer to secure hundreds of thousands of dollars in raw building materials. He was weaponizing my corporate reputation to float his sinking business, quietly tying my completely separate professional identity to his toxic, collapsing debt. He was far more reckless and far more dangerous than I had ever calculated. I met Celia for a late dinner in a private booth at a dim, quiet steakhouse across town. I handed her the encrypted flash drive containing the forensic contractor's preliminary data pull and a freshly printed copy of the lumberyard credit application. She reviewed the documents with a terrifyingly calm, predatory expression. "He is actively digging his own grave," Celia said, sliding the papers carefully into her leather briefcase. "And Vivian is handing him the shovel. But you need to understand the absolute rules of engagement for the next 48 hours. She leaned across the heavy oak table, her eyes locking onto mine with an unblinking intensity. "You cannot post a single vague quote on social media," Celia instructed. "You cannot call your mutual friends to vent or test their loyalty. You cannot kick him out of the townhouse tonight. And above all else, you absolutely cannot do anything that tips him off that you are fighting back. This is not a street fight. Andrea, we do not win this with a screaming match. We win this with an avalanche of undeniable, catastrophic paper. I want him out of my sight," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "And he will be," she promised. "But if you let him see that you are building a federal case, he will panic. He will systematically destroy the physical evidence. He might try to pull the fraudulent loan application before he actually submits it to the underwriter. We need him to submit it. We need him to physically cross the line from intent to federal fraud. The trap only works if he walks completely inside. Her advice was a bitter, agonizing pill to swallow. But strategically, it was flawless. You have to go back to that house tonight and play the exact role he desperately needs you to play, Celia continued. Be the distant, exhausted, work-obsessed wife. Let him think his little emotional manipulation in the kitchen yesterday actually worked. Let him believe you are too distracted by your job to notice the guillotine hanging over your head. You have to make him feel secure enough to trap himself with his own choices. I agreed. It was the most ruthless, emotionally draining decision I had ever made. I drove back to the townhouse late that evening. The lights were low. Nolan was sitting on the living room sofa, nursing a heavy glass of bourbon, watching the front door with cautious, terrified eyes. He was waiting for the inevitable explosion. He was bracing for me to pack a suitcase and storm out into the night, exactly as he and Vivian had meticulously planned in their deleted text messages. Instead, I walked calmly past him, set my keys on the console table, and pulled a massive stack of completely meaningless compliance reports out of my briefcase. I have to work late, I told him, keeping my voice flat and completely devoid of warmth. I did not make eye contact. The Dallas merger left a massive logistical mess on my desk. I am going to be in my office for the rest of the night. Please do not wait up. I saw his shoulders physically drop. I saw a profound, sickening wave of relief wash over his face. He thought I had retreated into my usual coping mechanism. He thought I was ignoring the friction in our marriage to focus entirely on my corporate duties. He thought the coast was completely clear. I walked into my home office and pulled the heavy mahogany door shut behind me. I sat down at my desk, turned on the small brass lamp, and opened my laptop. The true war had finally begun, and I was going to fight it in absolute silence. At Blackridge Compliance Group, my entire professional existence revolves around the anatomy of a lie. I do not catch corporate thieves by kicking down doors or shouting accusations in crowded boardrooms. I catch them by tracing the mundane, invisible threads they leave behind. I spend my days hunting down phantom vendors, billing for non-existent services. I look for forged invoices that are just a fraction of a percent off the industry standard. I look for transaction chains that loop in meaningless, convoluted circles just to hide the origin of a single wire transfer. People who commit fraud always think they are smarter than the system. They always believe their tracks are perfectly covered. They forget that the system records every single keystroke, every login, and every deleted file. Sitting in the shadowed quiet of my home office, listening to the muffled thud of footsteps above me, I applied that exact same forensic methodology to my marriage. The glow of my laptop screen was the only source of light in the room. It was past 2 o'clock in the morning. Nolan was asleep upstairs, blissfully unaware that the woman he thought was drowning in corporate paperwork was actually dissecting his entire financial existence. I had already secured my physical assets and fortified my professional boundaries. Now, I needed to understand the exact anatomy of their disease. I reopened the general ledger for Pierce Atelier Homes and started running a standard vendor variance analysis. The exact same diagnostic tool I used to catch millions of dollars in corporate graft at my day job. It did not take long for the system to flag a severe anomaly. Over the past 14 months, Nolan's company had issued 22 separate payments to a subcontractor listed as Vesper House Media. The invoices were uniformly vague, categorized under interior staging and creative media consulting. The amounts were staggering. $7,500 here, $12,200 there. I pulled the master vendor file and checked the tax identification number against the state corporate registry. Vesper House Media was registered as a limited liability company exactly 14 months ago. The registered agent and sole managing member was Vivian Shaw. I dug into the public records. The company had no commercial office space, only a post office box located in a strip mall 3 towns over. There were no payroll records, no registered employees, and absolutely no digital footprint of actual completed projects. It was a ghost entity, a perfectly hollow shell. I opened Nolan's active client files and cross-referenced the Vesper House Media invoices against the actual labor schedules for those specific construction sites. The dates did not align. Nolan was billing his clients for high-end interior staging on properties that were still nothing more than bare drywall and exposed electrical wiring. The sickening truth materialized on my screen. Nolan was not just a failing businessman, he was an active embezzler. He was siphoning cash out of his own company, stealing directly from his clients' escrow accounts, and laundering the money through Vivian's fake media agency. Those stolen funds were not just financing their secret hotel rendezvous. They were desperately plugging the gaping holes in Vivian's sinking event planning business, paying off her platinum credit card balances, and maintaining the glittering, wealthy facade they both projected to the world. They were cannibalizing innocent people to fund their delusion, but the financial rot was only the secondary infection. The true malignancy was hidden in the communications. While the digital forensics contractor had secured the network, I decided to run a manual search through the deleted items folder of Nolan's primary personal email account. Amateurs always assume that clicking the trash icon erases their sins. They never check the synchronized draft folders. I found a nested chain of drafts, unsent, but automatically saved over the course of the last 3 weeks. It was a correspondence between Nolan and a mid-level family law attorney. The subject line read, "Initial consultation notes." I opened the earliest draft and felt the breath get knocked out of my lungs. The fraudulent mortgage application was never the endgame. It was merely the funding mechanism for the endgame. The emails explicitly outlined Nolan's timeline. Step 1 was securing the bridge loan against my townhouse by Friday to save his company from bankruptcy and pay off Vivian's legal settlement. Step 2, scheduled for the following Monday, was to proactively file for a contested divorce. Nolan wanted to strike first. He wanted to blindside me with legal papers the moment the stolen funds cleared the bank. But to win a highly contested divorce and secure an unearned share of my personal wealth, he needed a compelling narrative. He needed to prove that I was an unfit, unstable partner who had destroyed the marriage. I opened the final draft in the chain. It was an attached document, formatted as a sworn legal affidavit. I read the words they had written about me. The document claimed that over the past 2 years, I had become entirely unhinged by corporate stress. It stated that I was a hostile, erratic presence in the home. It accused me of being heavily dependent on prescription sleeping pills to function, prone to paranoid outbursts, and completely detached from reality. The affidavit painted a vivid, horrifying picture of a cold, emotionally abusive wife who treated her husband like a financial parasite. And at the bottom of this entirely fabricated, character-assassinating document was a placeholder for a witness signature. The witness prepared to swear under oath that every single lie in that document was the absolute truth was Vivian Shaw. They were not just planning to take my house. They were planning to take my sanity. They had spent months carefully scripting a version of me that was so damaged, so toxic, that any judge would look at my husband with profound sympathy. If I had not come home 2 days early, if I had simply walked in on Thursday afternoon as planned, I would have walked blindly into a meticulously constructed slaughterhouse. The sheer scale of the psychological violence was paralyzing. My phone vibrated on the desk, shattering the heavy silence of the office. The screen illuminated with a text message from a woman named Sarah, a mutual friend who had known Vivian and me since our college days. "Hey," the message read, "just checking in on you. I know work has been absolutely brutal lately. We are all getting a little worried about your mental pressure. Please tell me you are taking care of yourself and not relying on those heavy sleep aids anymore. Let us get lunch soon." I stared at the glowing text, a cold, sharp knife twisted deep in my gut. The rumors were already out there. Nolan and Vivian had not just drafted a legal document. They had already launched the Whisper campaign. For weeks, they had been planting seeds of concern among my social circle, shaking their heads at dinner parties, playing the roles of the deeply concerned husband and the worried best friend. They had been softly conditioning everyone I knew to believe that I was losing my mind. When the divorce was finally filed, my friends would not be shocked. They would nod sadly and say they saw the collapse coming. I set the phone down. I did not reply to Sarah. The deepest pain of this entire nightmare was no longer the image of Vivian's golden sandals next to my husband's shoes. Physical infidelity is a common, predictable tragedy. It is cheap, but what they were doing was an intricate, malicious art form. They had sat together, perhaps drinking wine in my living room while I was on a plane to Dallas, and actively co-authored a twisted, grotesque caricature of my life. They needed me to be the villain so they could sleep at night. They needed to destroy my reputation to justify their theft. I closed the draft folder. I downloaded the Vesper House media invoices and the unsent affidavit to my encrypted drive. My hands were no longer shaking. The residual heartbreak that had been clinging to my ribs entirely evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a pure, unadulterated focus. They thought I was an exhausted, pill-popping workaholic who was about to lose everything she had ever built. They had completely forgotten what I did for a living. I hunt liars. And I was going to burn their entire fabricated world straight to the ground. I found Nolan in the kitchen on Wednesday morning. He was nursing a black coffee, his shoulders tense, dark shadows bruising the skin beneath his eyes. He looked like a man waiting for a bomb to detonate. I poured my own cup, walked over to the opposite side of the marble island, and looked at him. I stripped my voice of any hostility, leaving only the weary, pragmatic tone of a corporate executive dealing with a tedious logistical issue. "We need to figure out how we are going to handle this," I said quietly. Nolan stiffened, his grip tightening on his mug. "Andrea, I can explain everything. It was a mistake." "I do not want an explanation," I interrupted, keeping my expression perfectly flat. "I want to talk about damage control. You know exactly what my position at Blackridge Compliance entails. A messy public domestic dispute is entirely out of the question. A scandal could trigger a moral turpitude clause in my executive contract. I am not going to let a personal failure detonate my professional life." He blinked, struggling to process my absolute lack of tears. "I do not want screaming," I continued, swirling the dark liquid in my cup. "I do not want a war. I want things handled quietly. If we can process this civilly, without attorneys turning it into a public spectacle, I might even consider selling the townhouse so we can just split the equity and walk away cleanly." The profound wave of relief that washed over his face was almost embarrassing to witness. His posture instantly deflated. The panicked edge in his eyes vanished, replaced immediately by a sickening, arrogant comfort. He entirely mistook my strategic retreat for corporate cowardice. He genuinely believed I was terrified of office gossip, prioritizing my resume over my pride. My fake proposition gave him the exact false security he needed to move forward with his theft. He thought I was rolling over. By noon, acting under Celia's strict, brilliant direction, I constructed the snare. I needed to give Nolan something to steal. It had to look authentic enough to pass a panicked, amateur inspection, but legally toxic enough to trigger an automatic federal fraud flag the second it crossed an underwriter's desk. I sat in my home office and printed a fresh property addendum. I took a high-resolution scan of my real signature from an old contract, but I intentionally offset the digital sizing by 4%. I altered the date of the notary seal to a Sunday, a day when absolutely no state-licensed notary operates in our jurisdiction. I purposefully mismatched the pagination, labeling the crucial signature page as page 9 of 8. It was a masterpiece of subtle, fatal errors. To the untrained eye of a desperate contractor, it looked like a golden ticket. To a forensic auditor, it looked like a federal crime. I placed the forged bait file inside a standard manila folder and slid it into the middle drawer of my desk, right beneath a stack of blank envelopes. While I was planting the bait, Celia was aggressively working the back channels. She secretly contacted the compliance director at Ashwell Bridge Capital and the independent title attorney handling Nolan's impending closing. We did not ask them to freeze the account or block his appointment. We explicitly instructed them to flag the file and let the clock run. We needed Nolan to confidently walk into their office and physically hand over the fraudulent paperwork. We needed him to cross the threshold from intent to execution. At 3 o'clock that afternoon, my phone lit up with a sudden barrage of messages. They were from Vivienne. I read them while sitting in my glass-walled office at Blackridge, marveling at the sheer audacity of her pathology. She was frantically trying to control the narrative, terrified that I was going to blow up her fragile social standing before she could secure her illicit payout. "Andrea, please," the first message read. "Nolan manipulated me. I was in a terrible place mentally and he totally took advantage of my vulnerability. I had no idea he was messing with your property. I swear to God, please do not hate me. I am a victim here too." It was a staggering display of manipulation. I did not block her number. I did not unleash my fury. I typed a single, perfectly ambiguous reply. "I am just trying to process everything right now. Give me some time." It was a meticulously calibrated half measure. It kept her dangling on the hook, entirely unsure if I was a gullible, broken friend ready to forgive, or an apex predator silently gathering ammunition. The true test of my discipline arrived on Thursday morning. I had a mandatory quarterly risk assessment presentation in front of the Blackridge Executive Board. I stood at the head of the main conference room in a tailored navy suit and delivered a flawless 90-minute breakdown of international vendor liabilities. I answered every aggressive, high-level question from the chief financial officer with absolute precision. My voice never wavered. My hands never shook. I compartmentalized the burning wreckage of my personal life with a cold, terrifying efficiency, because while I was projecting perfect control, Nolan was rapidly falling apart. My unnatural calm had entirely destabilized him. He expected me to be crying, throwing his clothes onto the front lawn, and demanding answers. My absolute silence was suffocating him. He simply did not know what I knew. By Thursday afternoon, I received 2 separate phone calls from mutual friends asking if Nolan was all right. They told me he was acting incredibly erratic, snapping at subcontractors, sweating through his shirts, and obsessively checking his phone. The whisper campaign they had started weeks ago to paint me as the unstable, paranoid wife was spectacularly backfiring. I was running board meetings, and Nolan was the one jumping at shadows, visibly cracking under the invisible, crushing pressure of his own Friday deadline. Thursday evening, I attended a mandatory client dinner with the Blackridge executive team at a high-end steakhouse downtown. I sat between the managing director and a senior partner, sipping sparkling water and discussing supply chain logistics over expensive cuts of meat. I was deliberately miles away from my townhouse. I had told Nolan my dinner would go late. I gave him an empty house, total privacy, and a ticking clock. At exactly 8:15, my phone vibrated silently against my thigh. I excused myself from the table, walked into the quiet, heavily carpeted hallway near the private dining rooms, and unlocked my screen. It was a push notification from the discrete security application I had installed. I had ordered the digital forensics contractor to place a microscopic, magnetic contact sensor on the inside track of my home office desk drawer. The alert glowed stark white against the dark background of my screen. Office desk drawer 2. Opened. I leaned against the flocked wallpaper, staring at the timestamp. A cold, sharp thrill ran down my spine. He took the bait. Nolan had just reached into the dark, pulled out the legally toxic, purposefully flawed documents, and sealed his own fate. I took a deep, steadying breath, smoothed the front of my suit jacket, and walked back into the dining room to finish my steak. Let him sleep well tonight. Tomorrow morning, the trap would finally snap shut. I returned to the townhouse late Thursday night, expecting the heavy silence of an empty home. Instead, I found Nolan pacing the length of the kitchen. He was entirely sober, but he radiated a frantic, vibrating energy. The moment I set my briefcase down, he launched into a desperate, theatrical performance. He was playing the cornered, honorable husband, pulling out the one weapon he thought I could not resist. "I am losing the company. Andrea," Nolan said, his voice cracking with meticulously rehearsed emotion. "Ashwell Bridge Capital is calling in the entire debt. I have 35 employees who are going to lose their salaries and their health insurance by Monday morning if I do not inject cash into the operating account." He stepped closer, holding his hands up in a gesture of absolute surrender. I know I have been distant. I know I have made mistakes. But I'm begging you for a temporary solution. If you just sign a short-term equity release on this house, I can save the business and protect the crew. I swear to you, the moment I finalize the corporate restructuring in 6 months, I will pay back every single cent. I looked at his pleading face, my expression carefully blank. Inside, my pulse was a slow, steady drumbeat. I knew exactly why he was putting on this elaborate performance. He had already opened my desk drawer. He had already stolen the decoy documents I planted, but he was terrified. He knew that submitting a forged notary seal was a massive federal crime, and his cowardice was temporarily overriding his greed. He wanted me to voluntarily sign the real papers right now, so he would not have to risk going to prison tomorrow. I pretended to hesitate. I let my eyes drop to the marble counter, feigning the heavy burden of a conflicted wife. I need 48 hours to review your commercial ledgers before I sign anything tying my assets to your company, I told him softly. I saw the raw panic flash in his eyes. He swallowed hard, his jaw clenching. He did not have 48 hours. His absolute deadline to submit the loan packet to the underwriter was less than 12 hours away. My fake hesitation forced him perfectly into a corner. He realized he had no choice left but to use the stolen, legally toxic documents. He nodded quickly, backing away toward the stairs. "Okay," he whispered. "Okay, take your time." The pressure continued to escalate from every possible angle. Early Friday morning, before the sun had even fully breached the horizon, my doorbell rang. I opened the heavy oak door to find Vivian standing on the porch. She looked completely disheveled, her makeup intentionally smudged to simulate a night of agonizing tears. She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering in the cool morning air. "Andrea, please," Vivian sobbed, her voice trembling. "I have not slept in 2 days. I am so deeply sorry. I truly love Nolan. I really do. But I swear on my life, I had absolutely no idea he was planning to touch your financial assets. When I found out he was going after your house, I was sick to my stomach. You have to believe me." I stood perfectly still in the doorway, observing her performance. She was trying to detach herself from the sinking ship. She wanted to play the naive mistress, so she would not be implicated in the financial fraud. "Please," she continued, reaching out and gently touching my arm. "You have to talk to him before his Friday morning appointment. You can still stop him from making a terrible mistake." My forensic instincts flared, freezing the blood in my veins. I did not blink. I did not react. But my mind locked onto her exact phrasing like a steel trap. I had never mentioned any appointment to her. Nolan had never mentioned a specific time to me. The details of the loan closing were strictly confidential. The only possible way Vivian could know about a Friday morning appointment was if she was still actively managing the logistical execution of the fraud. Her tears were entirely fake. They were still working perfectly together, trying to manipulate my final moves. "I will handle my husband. Vivian," I said, my voice dropping to a freezing whisper. I stepped back and firmly shut the door in her face. 20 minutes later, my encrypted phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. It was a secure message from Celia Marr. While I was managing the emotional warfare at the house, Celia's hired private investigator had been relentlessly tailing Nolan. I opened the attached file. It contained a series of high-resolution photographs taken just moments ago. Nolan had fled our house at dawn, driving erratically to a cheap, hourly rental office space situated in a desolate suburban strip mall. The investigator had parked across the street, using a telephoto lens to shoot through the gap in the office blinds. The first photograph showed Nolan pacing nervously in the small room. The second photograph showed Vivian walking through the door, having driven straight there after her theatrical crying session on my porch. The third photograph was the killing blow. It showed Nolan and Vivian sitting across a cheap folding table from a disgraced former paralegal who now operated as a shady, off-the-books, notary public. Sitting in the dead center of the table was my thick manila folder. I zoomed in on the image until the pixels blurred. I could clearly read the mismatched pagination at the bottom of the visible page. Page 9 of 8. It was absolute, undeniable visual confirmation. They were physically preparing the decoy documents from my desk. The trap was no longer theoretical. They possessed the stolen goods, and they were actively authenticating them. I showered, dressed in my sharpest charcoal suit, and drove straight to the Black Ridge corporate campus. I fully expected my preemptive security disclosure to trigger a painful, humiliating human resources investigation. Nolan and Vivian had spent the last 2 months planting insidious rumors that I was mentally fragile, popping sleeping pills, and losing my grip on reality. They were banking on my corporate reputation shattering. Instead, I was immediately ushered into the glass-walled executive suite to meet with the managing director and the general counsel. They did not look at me with pity or suspicion. They looked at me with profound professional respect. Your proactive disclosure of a domestic financial conflict was exceptionally handled, Andrea, the managing director said, sliding my risk assessment file across the mahogany table. Most executives would try to hide a messy personal liability, which puts the entire firm at massive risk. You quarantined the threat immediately. You protected the company infrastructure before your husband could ever exploit it. The general counsel nodded in agreement. We have concluded our internal review. Not only is your security clearance fully maintained, but the board is actively evaluating you for the senior vice president vacancy. We need leaders who operate with absolute clinical precision under severe duress. I walked out of the executive suite, feeling a rush of pure, cold adrenaline. They had tried to paint me as an unstable liability to steal my life. Instead, my complete lack of emotional hysterics had just accelerated my corporate ascension. I drove back to the townhouse to pack a final overnight bag. The endgame was rapidly approaching. When I walked into the foyer, Nolan was standing at the bottom of the staircase. He was dressed in a sharp navy suit, his hair perfectly styled. He looked like a man preparing to conquer the world, utterly confident that his path was finally clear. "Listen to me," Nolan said, adopting a gentle, conciliatory tone. "I know the last 24 hours have been intense, but I do not want to lose you. I called a highly respected marriage counselor this morning. I pulled a massive favor, and he agreed to see us for an emergency intake session. A counseling session," I repeated, keeping my face perfectly neutral. "Yes," he insisted, stepping closer. "Today. We need to go today to start fixing this. His office is out in the western suburbs. It is a bit of a drive, about 45 minutes from here, but the appointment is locked in for exactly 9 o'clock this morning. I will leave right now, and I will meet you in his waiting room." I stared at him, marveling at the sheer, terrifying audacity of his final maneuver. The psychological manipulation was breathtaking. His actual loan closing with the title attorney and the fraudulent documents was scheduled for exactly 9 o'clock in the downtown financial district. He had deliberately booked a fake therapy session an hour outside the city in the opposite direction for the exact same time. He was attempting to send me on a futile, exhausting drive to ensure I was geographically trapped in a suburban waiting room while he sat in a downtown high-rise and officially stole my home. 9 o'clock, I said quietly, offering him a small, exhausted nod. "Okay, I will see you there." Nolan exhaled a massive breath, a victorious smile ghosting across his lips. He genuinely believed he had just successfully managed me into a corner. He grabbed his leather briefcase, the one currently holding my forged signature, and walked out the front door. He had absolutely no idea that he had not distracted me at all. He had just handed me the precise time and location to orchestrate his total destruction. The sun crested over the Philadelphia skyline, casting long, sharp shadows across the interstate as I drove westward. I maintained my speed exactly at the legal limit. My hands rested perfectly at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. I was heading toward a fictitious salvation. Nolan's intricately woven lie demanded that I spend the morning 30 miles away from the financial district, sitting in the waiting room of a marriage counselor who had absolutely no idea who we were. By agreeing to this charade, I gave my husband the ultimate gift. I gave him the illusion of total victory. While I navigated the morning traffic, the real battlefield was already prepped and waiting on the 42nd floor of a glass skyscraper downtown. Celia Marr does not leave anything to chance. She had arrived at the executive offices of Ashwell Bridge Capital an hour before the doors officially opened to the public. She was not sitting in the main lobby. She was securely positioned in an adjacent viewing room with the senior fraud investigator for the lending firm and the independent title attorney. They had formed a silent tribunal. They were waiting for the perpetrators to walk willingly into the kill zone. I pulled my car into the empty, cracked asphalt parking lot of the suburban medical park where my supposed therapy session was scheduled. I turned off the engine. The dashboard clock read exactly 8:55. I picked up my encrypted phone and waited in the suffocating silence of the cabin. At precisely 9 o'clock, the first secure message from Celia materialized on my screen. The primary target has entered the suite. I closed my eyes and pictured it. Nolan walking through the double glass doors of Ashwell Bridge Capital, wearing his tailored charcoal suit, his shoulders pulled back with the arrogant swagger of a man who believes he has outsmarted the entire world. He would be carrying his vintage leather briefcase, gripping the handle like a lifeline. A minute later, a second message arrived. The secondary target has arrived. She is carrying the supplemental binders. Vivian. She simply could not resist being in the room where it happened. She needed to watch the money clear to ensure her own debts would be paid, but she was careful to construct a plausible deniability buffer. By carrying the supplemental binders, she was attempting to cast herself as an administrative assistant, a helpful friend merely running an errand for a stressed business owner. She wanted the payout without the federal liability. She had no idea the room she just walked into was already a federal trap. I sat in my cold car, miles away from the crime, watching the digital play-by-play unfold on my screen. The wait was excruciating. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. They were sitting at the massive mahogany table now. Nolan was likely smiling, making charming, self-deprecating jokes to the loan officer to project confidence. He was unzipping his briefcase. He was sliding the thick manila folder across the polished wood. At 9:14, my phone vibrated with a sharp, sustained buzz. It was an automated alert from the independent title attorney's secure server, automatically forwarded to my inbox by Celia. The subject line read, "Document verification flag." I opened the secure portal. The lender's underwriting assistant had scanned the physical packet Nolan submitted into their system to initiate the wire transfer protocol. The moment the laser scanner hit the bottom of the property addendum, the system caught the microscopic anomaly I had designed, the offset digital sizing, the mismatched pagination, page 9 of 8. The Invalid Sunday Notary Seal. A follow-up text from Celia appeared immediately beneath the alert. The forged documents have been physically handed over to the underwriter. They have formally signed the submission register. Federal wire fraud is now actively in progress. The crime is absolute. I locked the screen of my phone and dropped it onto the passenger seat. For weeks, I had operated with the mechanical, bloodless efficiency of a machine. I had compartmentalized the betrayal, filed away the heartbreak, and treated my own life as a hostile corporate audit. But reading those final words broke the dam. My hands, which had been perfectly steady for days, suddenly began to tremble. The tremor traveled up my arms, seizing my shoulders and rattling my chest. I gripped the leather steering wheel, pressing my forehead against my knuckles, and allowed myself to shatter. I let out a harsh, jagged breath that sounded entirely unfamiliar to my own ears. A single, hot tear broke free and traced a burning path down my cheek. They really did it. The man I stood at an altar with, the woman I trusted with every secret I possessed. They walked into a room and confidently tried to erase my existence for a payout. The sheer, terrifying magnitude of their cruelty crashed over me in a suffocating wave. I stayed like that for exactly 60 seconds. I gave the grief 1 minute of my time. Then, I lifted my head. I opened the center console, pulled out a silk handkerchief, and wiped my face until my skin was dry. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror. My eyes were cold. My jaw was set in granite. The woman who came home 2 days early was entirely gone. The victim they had spent months trying to manufacture never existed in the first place. I turned the ignition key. The engine roared to life. I shifted the car into drive and pulled out of the empty parking lot, leaving the fictitious therapy session behind forever. The drive back into the city was a blur of concrete and chrome. I did not listen to the radio. I listened only to the rhythmic hum of the tires against the asphalt, a steady march toward the execution block. I navigated the dense downtown traffic with surgical precision, pulling my car into the subterranean parking garage beneath the Ashwell Bridge Capitol building. I walked into the grand lobby. The marble floors gleamed under the recessed lighting. I bypassed the main reception desk, flashing the temporary visitor badge Celia had securely messaged to my digital wallet, and walked straight to the express elevators. I pressed the button for the 42nd floor. The stainless steel doors slid shut, sealing me inside a silent, ascending chamber. The digital numbers above the door ticked upward. 30, 35, 40. The elevator chimed with a soft, melodic ring. The heavy metal doors parted smoothly. I stepped out onto the thick, plush carpet of the executive suite. The air was cool and smelled faintly of expensive furniture polish and ozone. I walked down the long, silent corridor, my low heels making no sound against the flooring. At the end of the hall was the primary conference room. The walls were made of thick, floor-to-ceiling frosted glass, designed to offer privacy while still letting in the natural light. I stopped 10 feet away from the glass. I did not need to see their faces clearly to recognize the silhouettes seated inside. Nolan was leaning back in a plush leather chair, his legs casually crossed, his posture radiating the relaxed satisfaction of a man who believes the hardest part of his life is finally over. Next to him, Vivian was leaning forward, her posture rigid with anticipation, her hands clasped tightly on the edge of the table. They were staring intently at the door on the opposite side of the room, waiting for the loan officer to return with the final wire transfer confirmation. They were waiting for the millions of dollars that would wash away their sins and fund their new reality. They had absolutely no idea that the door they were watching was the wrong one. They had no idea that the money was never coming. And they had no idea that the true architect of their destruction was currently standing just inches away on the other side of the glass, waiting to tear their entire world apart. I pushed open the heavy glass door, just as the senior loan officer was uncapping his gold fountain pen to initiate the final wire transfer sequence. Celia Marr stepped into the room precisely half a second behind me, her leather briefcase swinging at her side like a scythe. The sudden change in air pressure made everyone at the mahogany table look up. Nolan's smug, victorious smile did not just fade, it shattered. His face drained of all color, turning a sickly, translucent shade of gray. Next to him, Vivian gasped, her hands recoiling from the edge of the table as if the polished wood had suddenly caught fire. "Good morning," I said, my voice cutting through the sterile air of the 42nd floor. I did not sit down. I stood at the head of the table, flanked by my attorney. "Andrea," Nolan choked out, his vocal cords paralyzed by pure, unadulterated terror. "What are you doing here? You are supposed to be at the clinic. And you are supposed to be saving your company," I replied smoothly. I turned my gaze to the independent title lawyer sitting across from my husband. "Please tell him." The title lawyer did not blink. He picked up the manila folder Nolan had confidently handed over 10 minutes ago. "Mr. Pierce," the lawyer began, his tone devoid of any professional courtesy, "we have halted the underwriting process. The document you submitted as a spousal property addendum is a fraudulent splice. The notary seal on the bottom half was physically copied from a defunct deed, and the signature page itself is from an expired refinancing packet. It is entirely legally void." Nolan practically convulsed in his chair. He turned his panicked eyes toward Vivian, who was actively shrinking into the leather upholstery, desperately trying to become invisible, before he could attempt to formulate a lie. I unlatched my own briefcase. I did not raise my voice. I simply let the paper trail do the screaming. I laid the first stack of documents right in front of him. These are the smart lock logs and the security camera diagnostic reports. I stated calmly. They show Vivian entering the townhouse exactly 9 times using a guest code, followed immediately by the manual deactivation of the second-floor surveillance feed. I placed the second stack down. These are the home network printer spools and the recovered cloud synchronization data, detailing the exact minute you printed the forged deed and the blank signature templates. Then, I placed the final, thickest binder directly between Nolan and his mistress. And this is the complete transaction ledger showing thousands of dollars systematically embezzled from Pierce Atelier Homes and laundered straight into Vesper House Media, a ghost entity registered to Vivian Shaw. The room was dead silent, save for the ragged, shallow sound of Nolan breathing. The senior fraud representative from Ashwell Bridge Capital finally stood up. He looked down at my husband with absolute disgust. "Your loan application is officially terminated due to material fraud," the representative declared. Furthermore, attempting to leverage a stolen identity to secure commercial funding is a severe violation. We are legally obligated to forward this entire file, along with the fabricated collateral documents you submitted today, to the Financial Crimes Division for immediate civil and regulatory review. Nolan buried his face in his hands. The polished, confident contractor was entirely gone, replaced by a broken, pathetic man who had just watched his entire future evaporate in less than 3 minutes. But I was not finished. The financial ruin was just the baseline. I wanted the psychological closure. I reached into my jacket pocket, pulled out a single sheet of paper, and slid it across the table until it touched his fingertips. It was the transcript of their deleted text messages. "You wanted my house," I told him, my voice dropping to a low, lethal register. That was just greed, but trying to convince my friends that I was losing my mind? Planning to gaslight me into a mental breakdown so you could play the victim in divorce court? That was purely evil. Vivian finally broke. She let out a loud, ugly sob, covering her face. "I am sorry," she wept. "I am so sorry." "Save it for your own bankruptcy hearing," I told her coldly. I turned my back on both of them and walked out of the glass room, leaving them entirely trapped in the wreckage of their own making. The fallout was swift and absolute. Before the sun even set that evening, Celia executed the final phase of our counterattack. Nolan's largest corporate client received a highly detailed, legally protected notification regarding the false lien waivers and the fake subcontractor invoices tied to his projects. By Monday morning, his primary construction contract was completely frozen. His company plummeted into a total, unrecoverable freefall. Vivian fared no better. The high society circles she desperately clung to have a zero-tolerance policy for financial predators. When her remaining event planning partners discovered she was not just a tragic woman caught in a scandalous romance, but the active co-architect of a malicious property fraud scheme, every single one of her consulting contracts was immediately canceled. The divorce settlement was a massacre, armed with mountains of irrefutable evidence of financial abuse and attempted fraud. Celia decimated his legal defense. I kept the townhouse. I kept every single cent of my premarital assets. I kept my investment portfolios, and the judge forced Nolan to assume the entirety of the crushing debt he had created. He lost his wife, he lost his business, and he lost the very financial foundation he thought he was clever enough to steal. 3 months later, the townhouse was finally quiet. I did not spend my evenings crying over old photographs. I did not scream at the walls. Instead, I hired a crew to come in and rip out the old patterned runner on the grand staircase. I had them replace it with a thick, pristine cream wool. I walked into the foyer and unscrewed the heavy brass tray from the console table, the exact spot where those metallic gold sandals had once violently announced my new reality. I threw the brass tray directly into the garbage. In its place, I set down a smooth, heavy black stone bowl. It holds nothing but my own keys. Coming home 2 days early was never about catching a predictable, mundane affair. It was about arriving just in time to save myself from a perfectly orchestrated erasure. Now, when I walk through my front door and step up that staircase, my heels clicking softly against the new wool. It is not the sound of a broken home. It is the sound of a woman who systematically took back her entire house, her good name, and the absolute ownership of her own story. Thank you all so much for listening to my story today, and I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please leave a comment below to share your thoughts. Subscribe to Amelia Revenge Stories, like the video, and do not forget to click the hype button so this story can reach even more people.